Hello, welcome to the session on team reasoning and collective moral obligation. My name is Olle Blomberg and I'm a researcher at Gothenburg University in Sweden.
And I am Björn Petersson and I work as a philosopher at the philosophy department in Lund University.
Right, so we will launch straight into a case for you to consider, which we call burning building. And the case is this: 3 children are trapped in a burning building. 2 of them are in one room and the third in another room some distance away. The neighbors Alessandro and Olivier see each other approaching the building from opposite sides. Alessandro breaks in and has enough time to rescue either the 2 children in the first room or the 1 child in the second room. However, the rescue can succeed only if Olivier heads straight for the same room with his fire extinguisher. If both go to the first room, then the 2 children will be rescued. If both go to the second room, then the 1 child will be rescued. If each goes to a different room, however, then no child will be rescued. All 3 will die. Suppose that Alessandro and Olivier can make these choices without any significant risk to their own or each other's life or health. Suppose also that all that I've described here is common knowledge between Alessandro and Olivier. Now, it seems to us that Alessandro and Olivier are morally obliged to save the 2 children, to rescue the 2 children. It would make sense to address them with a moral imperative in this case. You must save the 2 children. Call this the basic intuition. Most people working on moral obligations in collective contexts agree that this at least is how it seems, or at the very least, that this is how we speak. What supports the intuition that Alessandro and Olivier together have the moral obligation is that only together do they have the ability to rescue the 2 children. And rescuing the 2 children, furthermore, is the best they can do together, morally speaking.
However, Holly Lawford Smith argues that for a joint ability to be of the kind required for possessing a moral obligation to fire, the entity that has the ability must be such that it can try to fire. And according to Lawford Smith, only a single moral agent can try to fire. But arguably, a plurality of moral agents could together try to fire, where this just amounts to each of them trying to do their part of them firing together. Another reason for thinking that basic intuition must be rejected is that only an entity that can deliberate and make decisions can be the subject of a moral obligation. The basic intuition concerns a deliberative moral obligation. It's connected to the deliberative question, what ought I do? This seems to imply that Alessandro and Olivier can have the moral obligation only if they together constitute an entity that is capable of asking and settling on an answer to this central deliberative question. Since they don't constitute a collective moral agent, one might think that they don't have the moral obligation that they seem to have.
One might try to respond to this by suggesting that the group asking and answering the deliberative question simply amounts to each member asking and answering the question, what ought I do? However, if Alessandro starts out asking what he ought to do, then there is arguably no determinate answer to this question. After all, what Alessandro ought to do depends on what he reasonably expects Olivier to do, and vice versa. This is a moral version of a general challenge for orthodox individualistic game theory, to make sense of our intuitions about rational choices in some coordination games, such as the so-called high-low game, for example. And burning building is a moral version of a high-low game. There's another reason why a collective moral obligation cannot be reduced in this way to several parallel answers to the question, what ought I do? Plausibly, the subject of a deliberative obligation to FI must not only have the ability to FI, but also the ability to FI for the normative reasons that make FIing obligatory. Alessandro and Olivier would lack this ability if they couldn't deliberate on the basis of their joint ability to rescue the two children. That is, if each were restricted to asking and answering the question, what ought I do? They could at most each then have an individual moral obligation to go to the first room and do their part of saving the children. There would be no obligation to rescue the two children. Since a group such as that consisting of Alessandro and Olivier isn't itself a deliberating and decision-making agent, it might thus seem like the basic intuition must be rejected, unless, that is, it is possible for each of them to ask and answer without mistake or delusion, what we do.
In this paper, we want to explain and vindicate this basic intuition. We will explain not only why we have the intuition, but try to explain why it makes sense. A virtue, we think, of our account is that it doesn't separate the subjects of the moral obligation from those toward whom we would address a moral advice or moral imperative. In Burning Building, Alessandro and Olivier are the subjects of the obligation, and it is to them we would direct the moral advice to save the two children. Giving such advice makes sense because it's possible for Alessandro and Olivier to each ask, what ought we do? We will argue that when we ascribe a moral obligation to FI to several agents, considered collectively, we do so on the implicit assumption that each agent has a capacity to identify with the group and view the decision situation from the group's point of view.
The notion of group identification or group identity have been central in social psychology since the 70s. Importantly for our purposes, experimental evidence suggests that group identification leads individuals in social dilemmas to be concerned about and act on the group's interests rather than their own private interests. In these experiments, group identity has been induced through pre-existing shared community membership, through common fate, or through face-to-face discussion, for example. Now, the important thing is that the hypothesis that group identification tends to lead to cooperation with in-group members is a plausible live hypothesis.
According to Michael Bacharach, group identification can also be triggered by the strong interdependence that exists between individuals' interests in a social dilemma, such as the prisoner's dilemma or the high-low game. As far as we know, this hypothesis has not been experimentally tested, though. Group identification, according to Bacharach, will in turn lead to team reasoning. And Bacharach's model of team reasoning is tailor-made for understanding how individuals who find themselves in potential social dilemmas can rationally choose the alternative that is collectively the best one. The team reasoner views the decision situation from the point of view of the group. She asks herself what we should do rather than what I should do for us. She evaluates the courses of action available to the group and infers which component of the collective action that she should perform. The last step means that each individual asks herself, what should I do as part of what we should do? The team reasoner identifies with the group in a strong sense. The shift from I reasoning to we reasoning is what Bacharach calls an agency transformation, as opposed to a mere preference transformation. We suggest that the ascription of a collective moral obligation to save the two children to Alessandro and Olivier appeals to their capacity for group identification and practical reasoning from a first-person plural perspective. The assignment of the obligation makes sense on the assumption on that assumption, since it allows them to each reason on the basis of what they can do together. We also implicitly assume that they are capable of acting on the result of their deliberation, that is, of performing the collective action required to fulfill the obligation. However, our focus here is a certain individual capacity that makes the assignment of a collective obligation meaningful in cases where no collective moral agent yet has been formed. Not all the capacities that then must be exercised to fulfill such an obligation.
In Burning Building, there is a salient collective action alternative open for the group, an option that intuitively has the morally best result and intuitively ought to be performed. But our account does not involve any substantial or substantive moral commitments about what individuals or groups ought to do in specific cases. Depending on one's moral outlook, one could deny that agents are always morally obliged to perform the action that yields the morally best result, for example. The account would not be incompatible with this. Our point is just that we can explain why the assignment of the obligation to the yet unstructured collective makes sense. If we assume that such assignments come with implicit assumptions about the individual's capacity to identify with the group and deliberate from the first person plural perspective. This necessary condition is a key to understanding how it is possible at all for an unstructured group to have a moral obligation. Potential high-low cases like Burning Building, for example, illuminate the functional difference between I reasoning and team reasoning, and the role of group identification. Insofar as people tend to get it right in such social dilemmas, this is support for the assumption that group identification in the strong sense actually occurs. But there is no reason to restrict the possibility of group identification and team reasoning to collective choice situations with that structure, the high-low structure.
The question of whether an individual is capable of group identification might concern the individual's general social capacities, her ability to view things from the group perspective in any situation where external conditions for group identification are favorable. It could also be a question about her ability to group identify in a specific choice context, and it is the latter context-dependent capacity that we have in mind when we claim that the group member's capacity for group identification is a necessary condition for meaningful assignments of collective obligations to unstructured groups. According to Bacharach, group identification and team reasoning is irrationally prompted by the character of the choice situation. It is not something that an agent can choose to adopt. To what extent is Bacharach right that group identification isn't a matter of choice? If identifying with a group involves believing that one belongs to a group, then one arguably cannot directly choose to identify with it. Beliefs are acquired rather than chosen. However, within the current framework, conceiving of a decision situation from a group perspective is not supposed to be equivalent to believing that one is a member of the relevant group. The perspectival understanding of conditions for collectivity is a distinct alternative to accounts requiring a conception of the group in the content of the participants' attitudes.
Involuntarism seems to apply to perspectival features of cognition too, though. When I recall that shameful thing I did at the party 20 years ago, for example, I cannot choose whether or not it seems temporally close or distant in my memory. This might extend to the agential perspective from which I conceive a decision situation as well. In that case, it seems unreasonable to issue an obligation demanding that its primary addressees take one agential perspective rather than another. But consider an analogy here with visual perspectives. Once you're aware of the two ways in which you can perceive the duck-rabbit figure, for example, it becomes relatively easy to switch between the two interpretations. When this procedure becomes sufficiently automatic, the direct-indirect distinction may not matter much. If your life depended on me perceiving the duck in the duck-rabbit figure, it would not seem implausible to say that I had an obligation to do so, regardless of whether I could do it directly by choice, or if I had to do it indirectly, going via some kind of self-nudging, by trying to think of the side facing left as the front of a creature, for example. We do not yet want to take a position about these mechanisms here. It is partly an empirical question. Regardless of whether or not the perspective shift associated with group identification can be under direct or indirect intentional control, there is no neutral perspective from which we can objectively weigh reasons for and against taking the I perspective or the we perspective. So even if the we perspective can be chosen, it will be rationally chosen relative to an agential perspective. This too seems morally relevant. If we can provide the primary addressees of our assignment of a collective moral obligation with perspective neutral reasons to group identify, then it seems unreasonable to demand that they do so.
Descriptions of collective moral obligations presuppose a group perspective, that is a second or third person plural perspective, plural you or they. When one addresses the agents with "you must save the 2 children," one conceives of them as a group, and the ascribed obligation is relative to a perspective of collective rationality. Suppose that we cannot provide perspective-neutral reasons for group identification, and that the agents entering the burning building have not framed the situation from the collective point of view. Nevertheless, intuitively, it still makes sense to say that they are obliged to perform the collective act that moral team reasoning would prescribe. If our worries about voluntariness and about the possibility of perspective-neutral reasons are warranted, how should we explain this intuition?
When we say that a group has an obligation to phi, we imply that the group ought to phi and that it would be meaningful to address it with a moral imperative, phi. Such a moral imperative can be meaningful because it can contribute to group identification as an added element in the choice context. By commanding collective action, we stress the collective features of the case and appeal to the group members' capacity for group identification. By addressing them in this way, we may tip them over into taking the collective perspective. In standard examples of unstructured groups that intuitively have moral obligations, such as Virginia Held's much discussed subway passengers case, where the subway passengers failed to stop an assault, external conditions for group identification are typically favorable. In Held's case, the group is confined to a limited common space. For example, there are no obstacles to communication or signaling preparedness to coordinate, and so on. Little in this context should be needed to prompt group identification, and consequently, our moral intuition about the group's obligation seems strong and stable.
But in the burning building example, the description is less specific. Which are the opportunities for signaling and talking? Did the individuals get there together, or did they just happen to notice the other's presence? Is the group naturally delimited by some external factor? In other words, is the situation such that team reasoning should be expected at all? It seems to us that the strength of our intuitions about their collective obligation will vary with such additional features in a way that actually supports our theory. More favorable external conditions for group identification makes the assignment of an obligation to act collectively seem more apt. So it seems right that what we have called the basic intuition relies on an implicit assumption about the individual's capacity to identify with the group in the specific choice context. Now, if this is the explanation in the case where the individuals have not yet identified with the group, have we really done justice to the intuition that such a group has a collective obligation? Or have we merely shown that there may be good pragmatic or consequentialist reasons for addressing the group as if it had a collective obligation? On a prescriptivist understanding of obligation talk, like for instance Richard Hare's, if it is plausible to address the group with a moral imperative, then it's plausible to assign an obligation to it. It has an obligation in that sense. The function of assigning an obligation is simply to issue a moral imperative. Here we will leave this meta-ethical issue open, though. Thank you very much for listening and watching us. We look forward to objections and questions.
Thanks for listening.